here, for example, we could see how Putin lately has banned LGBT. So now it's illegal in Russia to be LGBT. LGBT people are often beaten up. Now you don't belong to the right part of the history. Now you're some kind of outsider that, you have to be bullied in the schools and etc.
Yeah. And a majority of all parties, including the Democrats, think there are only two genders.
The topics of free speech and identity politics have been at the very center of news nowadays. And in my case, in my university, I study in City University of London. We have the Student Assembly, which is a decision-making body designated to pass laws and rules, right, to make any decisions in the university. For instance, we have just passed the statement of our university on Palestine. Our university has passed
Can I actually stop you there? Because I think this is a good example of one thing which has been happening, which is this idea now that all educational institutions and all bodies need to have an opinion on all of these sorts of issues. So instead of letting students have their separate opinions on issues, every university now needs an opinion on Palestine and on Israel, which I think, again, it shows two issues and more. Like, first thing, why Palestine and Israel? We talk about, for example, not sending weapons to Israel. Most of the weapons in the UK that we send, over 50%, go to Saudi Arabia and Qatar. But that's never brought up. In terms of wars, and there was far less action for somewhere like Syria, but even Sudan or Myanmar, even in the Muslim world, where more people die, for example, in the Rohingya genocide in Myanmar, more people are affected overall by Chinese action in Xinjiang. What you find is a lot of science there. Why on Palestine? I think it's because it involves the West more directly. We see it as Israel as the West versus the other non-Western powers, and we now have an obsession with finding out what are the issues with the West. Secondly, we also have the issue, why does everyone need an opinion on everything, right? Because there's become this idea that your politics are part of your identity now. You have to have an opinion. You have to show, and also associating morality with politics. People now see some common political positions immoral. So they have to state them. They have to be on the right side of history as they see it, which I think is why you've had so many universities state their opinion on Palestine, when this makes absolutely no difference whatsoever, right? Netanyahu is not going to go tomorrow and say, oh, this random university in London or in America has suddenly condemned my Palestine policy. Oh, well, guys, I guess we need to go back. Sorry, I think I interrupted you. Go.
Yeah, and I think we can see this in the first example that you mentioned, which can also be brought up in the case of Ukraine and Russia war, because here you can see how the kind of conflict between the West and the East, and the kind of war between those two parts of the world is quite frankly seen. And here, for example, we could see how Putin lately has banned LGBT. So now it's illegal in Russia to be LGBT. LGBT people are often beaten up, which is quite a contradiction to what happens in the West, in America.
I think what we're actually seeing is, Uganda also a few years ago recently passed the law. What we're actually seeing is the Western policy on LGBTQ backfire. And by policy, I mean here is that, for decades and decades and decades, we were increasing gay rights, which is great, offering gay marriage and so on. And that was beginning to spread over the world. But now that much of the fighting is actually done, what you're seeing is LGBTQ groups, and notice how TQ were added to LGBT. Both are separate issues. And you can argue that it's argued rights, that there's discrimination, so on. But all the issues are brought into one, and people now need to feel like they need to voice and protest much more. So again, remember what I said earlier about your political position being part of your identity and the importance of being on the right side, they say, moral virtue. And what this leads is to people, they don't just now want to increase rights, but you see a lot of behavior which is intentionally supposed to kind of break barriers, intentionally supposed to make people feel uncomfortable to prove a point. But the problem is, when nations see this abroad, this doesn't actually help the case of
Oh yeah, but this is a very good example. On the example of Ukraine and Russia, we can see how Putin capitalized on the idea that a lot of people are not content with the fact that we are now somehow saying that if you don't support all the progressive ideas, now you don't belong to the right part of the history. Now you're some kind of outsider that, you have to be bullied in the schools and etc.
Yeah.
kind of thing.
But he's capitalized and seeing that as a Western thing. And the effect of this is countries, see this as a Western thing. They see kind of people trying to break barriers, trying to make people feel uncomfortable, with even things as little as kind of intentionally going out, clothing choices and so on that are supposed to break down barriers in this way. And that sounds good. But the problem is you look around the world and many people are uncomfortable because of this. And so they react back more violently. And especially you see kind of the dialogue used by a lot of trans rights activists, not even allowing for there to be a debate, calling anyone who presenting you're transphobic and so on, that gets seen very negatively. And so it actually causes a backlash in other parts of the world, in Uganda, in Russia, even China a few years ago, which banned the appearance of effeminate men on television. In places where people actually need real rights,
Exactly.
you are actually getting the opposite happening. Because I think this is a big impact seeing the left and progressives more generally. People are more concerned with being virtuous than with being effective. So what matters for LGBTQ rights movements isn't how effective they actually are in helping society accept them when helping other countries accept them. Because their point of view is if they don't accept them, they're bigots anyway, so why should we care? Their point of view is they're more interested in being virtuous and to do what they see as the right thing, which actually has an opposite impact. You look at people voting for Trump and so on. A lot of votes came over relatively minor things like the trans issue, which is a small thing compared to the economy. But it's because a certain segment of the progressive left have been pushing it so much, insulting people who have slightly different opinions so much that you have an opposite reaction. And which has led to people like Trump, which is actually going against what these progressives are want.
And would you think the figure like Trump would be popular if he wouldn't be able to capitalize and use this idea that the West is kind of falling, and this idea that the wrong things are promoted in schools, that LGBT is promoted in schools? Would you think the figure of Trump would be successful if the left was not pushing this agenda too much?
So obviously it's a complicated question because there's a lot of things that have gone to Trump's popularity. If you remove one thing, there's the restful part, I don't know, to be honest. But what I certainly know is he would be a lot less popular. It was a very, very popular campaigning platform. I think, I don't have the exact statistics right on, but I think poll shows that, 65% of Americans and a majority of all parties, including the Democrats, think there are only two genders. So, whether they're right or wrong, one thing, but the way people have been trying to go around convincing them to accept, um, the trans people and bisexual and all sorts of other groupings. The way they've gone about doing that is by essentially insulting them and calling them bigots, not trying to make them agree with it. And you see there's also things like racial issues with BLM and so on, where again, a lot of these riots what did they actually achieve? Nothing. Nothing actually achieved. To many people, it just seemed like they would take opportunities to harm cities, destroy cities. There were cases of looting and so on. And you can say that that's the whole movement or it's not, but that's the perception of it. And so Trump gains from this perception of thing. And one of the most effective ads that he ran near the end of his campaign was, she's for they, them. Yes, for us.
Yeah, I have seen that. This is very
Yeah, so first thing you could
blew up social media.
yeah, it was an incredibly effective ad. You compare that to the Democrats' ad of trying to say you can be a man and still vote for Kamala Harris. Um, but and personally, you can see how much popularity he's gained from that. You could see also around the world that because people see the establishment now as promoting these progressive ideas, anti-establishment politics to always be popular, once something which, the left dominated now becomes a right-wing thing. And you can also see, I think, people anger at being condescended and talked down to in a way, which is that economically, a lot of white working class people aren't doing very well. And I say white working, the whole working class, but the white working class feels ignored. You know, kind of all around the world, inflation's high, there's a cost of living crisis, wage growth has slowed down. And in some cases, people feel like the neighborhood are changing due to immigration. That might be rational, see, that might not be, but it's still a feeling people have. And they see what they see is the elite political class seem to condescend to them. They seem to completely ignore them to talk about minorities who are a minority. And at a time when minorities had never had more rights, people had never talked more about their need for to get more rights.
But even with BLM and even with LGBT rights and the fact you said that most of the people in the US, for example, say that there are only two genders, even those who vote Democrat, in a way that doesn't really matter, because the problem what people have with it is usage of force.
Mm.
So how the left uses force when people say something which doesn't go along with their agenda. So for example, even if somebody has said, I'm whatever, a man, a woman, in between, nobody really cares that much. I've never met a person which would have said, well, I would have a problem with a person just because he's considering himself to be uh, another identity.
Yeah.
The problem with this is that it becomes defining to the person, and some people just gain from the fact that they are whatever gender or whatever identity. I think it shouldn't be the thing, and people, this is what most of these things are going wrong in. For example, in my university, we this topic was very much brought up in student union, and one of our transgender students, which I get along with very well, and is I have no problem with him at all, but he has introduced an idea of reserving special seats within the assembly for LGBT only. So the idea was 6 seats for LGBT community members in the assembly, which is 50 people. So it's you can imagine it's more of 10%, right,
Mm.
of the assembly, which is quite a big proportion. And first question that comes to my mind is whether that's proportional to the amount of LGBT people in the university. And the second thing is, even if it is in a way proportionate, then would that be rational to give these people this reserved seats? Because then Ukrainians will demand their own seats, then other minorities will demand their own seats, and you can't really say that a certain group has experienced significantly more problems than the other group, because uh, black people have been impacted by slavery. Uh, LGBT people.
Well, I mean, it's important also to distinguish the situation of minorities in American Britain. People confuse them a lot, and that's a mistake. Slavery was of course, British Empire did slavery before banning slavery. But most black migrant communities in the UK, they've gone through a lot. I'm not denying that, but it wasn't slavery. Their issues, the oppression which they did face, is a different issue from that in America. So I cut you off there, but please continue.
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, that's pretty much what I wanted to mention. That we can't just designate seats to people, assuming that they have experienced more problems than other communities. And for example, this is a very good example with disabled people who you can't see them on social media complaining too much about their problems. But actually, I could see one of the cashiers in my shop, who has one arm and another arm is kind of supporting, but it's cut in half. And
And I think that there is something very infuriating about privileged middle class LGBTQ people or people from certain racial minorities complaining about these issues when you have people who may or may not be from a minority who deal with poverty, with actual problems into their living conditions, living paycheck to paycheck, feeling alienated by the rest of society. And what do they see the political class worry over? Privileged people with comparatively minor issues. Over a society, that's never been more tolerant to minority. Whether we are or not sufficiently, we're never getting more tolerant. But there have been times where there've been more income equality. There have been times that people have done when cost of living wasn't so bad. And so we see all these people feel excluded purposefully by the political process. And then we're surprised that they turn to increasingly radical political parties. Now, towards your two questions. So the first one, is it proportionate, the 10% of seats? I think so. There's a variety of polls that have been done to find what portion of population is LGBTQ, and you get 5 to 10, I think some higher. Yeah, it's about proportion. But I think this also ties into a bigger issue, which is the idea of what people call lived experience is important. Already the phrase lived experience is stupid. If you've experienced something, by definition, you've lived it, right? You can't experience something, in a TUI. But the reason that's done is to put more focus on it. We're making lived experiences and feelings more important than reason or what can logically gauge.
Exactly.
So people now feel offended, whether or not the intent was to offend, whether or not they should feel offended objectively. Is very good. What doesn't matter? It's all about truth and subjective viewpoint. Now, how does this tie in to the point you were bringing up about selecting seats for people? Because the idea now is that your representative has to look like you, right?
Right.
Your representative has to represent you, not your ideas, which is what matters.
But we can see in the parliaments, for example, when lords represent the ideas that they don't relate in a way to. I've been working with one of the lords who is responsible for the question of Haiti, which is clearly he's not from Haiti, and he might be the best person to actually represent Haiti because he has worked in Haiti and got a working experience, but it doesn't mean that he looks like Haitian people.
Yeah, and I think it's exactly the issue. So, people now don't think, does this person represent my ideas? Does this person look like me? Am I, are they ticking the right boxes? And this is a very, very, very stupid way of looking at representation, looking at politics. Diversity of ideas is what matters, not any other sort of diversity in politics. So, you know, I think that you see the Democrats continuously trying to foist women or ethnic minorities in for their candidates in America, whether or not it's the best qualified person. And you see the results. Kamala Harris was absolutely not the best qualified person to go the vice president or presidential candidate. She got there because of her status as a minority, and it didn't go well.
But I think they can actually.
Can I actually say one more there? Sorry. You also see a very, very worrying trend in sectarianism. So you've seen prominent areas of the Muslim community in the UK vote for candidates, who agree with them on one issue, Palestine. UK has very little say.
Yeah.
Essentially because it's the same religion, essentially because they look like them, and so on. And you are getting politics now divided along religious and ethnic lines, and that is a very dangerous thing. If we're looking for societal harmony, we should judge you by the content of their character and their ideas, not by the color of their skin. And also, this only goes one way, right? People only ever want minorities to be represented with minorities. If you use the same argument, then you could also say, well, white majority countries should, have governments that represent them, which is a stupid point, which no one should agree with. And no one does agree with them. We're happy when we had a prime minister of Indian origin in the UK. But then the people don't also bring that logic to other minorities like LGBTQ people in your university who should, care about having representatives who represent their ideas, not their sexual orientation.
But good question that I wanted to ask you is how can we actually, which I got asked by many of my friends who are more of a left-wing progressive side, which is how can we actually know whether the equality of rights and opportunities and outcomes mostly has been achieved in Europe and in UK. For example, if we take the statistics, which I don't agree, for example, that statistics, let's say, in 2024, there were, in European Parliament, there were 60% of male, MPs and 40% of female. It doesn't really show that men are dominating the field. It just shows that there were, in the given year, there were more male competent people selected by, in the parliament. So the question is, how do we identify whether the equality has been achieved, and whether you agree that the statistics doesn't really show it nowadays?
So this is a difficult question because when you're looking at a very broad field like the equality of groups in society, there's going to be a single statistic you can pull out of your hat. The issue is, first thing, the basic one is equality before the law. Do laws openly discriminate? The answer in Western society is no. Now the second point is, the problem is equality of, I'm forgetting the word, being given equal starting conditions does not mean equal outcome. So it's a complicated game. You have to judge. But whether inequalities in outcome reflect inequality as at the start. So let's take an example which is very often cited. Women in STEM. In a bunch of STEM fields, there are fewer women. So people say, well, this is sexism. There should be the same number of women. But if you actually look at the data there, it's not the picture it shows. Firstly, in some areas of STEM, there are more female students, in biology, for example. So are biologists just suddenly much more progressive than the rest of STEM? I don't think so. Also, you can look at in the OECD, you find that countries which have a higher ranking for women's rights have fewer women in STEM fields.
Exactly. That's exactly.
Very strong correlation. And in fact, if you look at countries with a terrible track records on women's rights, like Iran, there are actually more female engineering students than male engineering students. It's the opposite. The more the equality between women and men, the fewer women choose to go into a STEM field. So what that would say to me is that this isn't an inequality of sexism, of women being treated in a sexist way. This is just different choices being made. And in some fields, there are more women, in biology, for example, and in other fields outside STEM. That's fun. When you look at English majors, they're majoritarily women. No one calls sexism there. So equality, and in our society as well, there are certain ethnic groups that tend to do less well, that have less money. But there are other ethnic minorities that actually do even better than the native population. I mean, East Asians are a prominent example. So if you think that a minority which makes less knowledge does less well, if you think of that as a result of oppression and discrimination, then by the same logic, you'd have to say the minority which does better is somehow oppressing or discriminating against the majority, or the majority discriminates against itself, which is ridiculous. We have to recognize that different cultures value education to different levels. Different cultures have different, again, cultural values for education, for work, and so on. So you can't just look at the inequalities and assume that all of them are due to discrimination. So it's a very complicated question. To answer the question, I can tell. You have to look deeply, and there's no single answer. There's no kind of magic bullet where you can just say, oh, look at this, there is discrimination.
Yeah, but the problem, I'm going to play the devil's advocate here a bit, but the problem that many people would have with your argument that the equality of opportunity, do you mean that the equality of opportunity has been mostly given, and the fact that the laws, there are no laws, I would agree with you that there are no laws that explicitly say that there is,
Alas, so it's certainly equality of opportunity is certainly more present than has for ethnic and sexual orientations and for gender and so on. I think economically in the West it may not be so true anymore, but for those other qualities, I can certainly say the equality of opportunity is better than it has ever been. And that's an important thing to state because, people look at the West and say, look how racist Western societies are. Look at how they treat their immigrants. Let's go on. Look at how badly immigrants treat in the West. Is there any society in the history of the world which has taken so many immigrants in so short a period of time and treat them so well as we have here? So you always need a benchmark for comparison. So certainly we have better equality of opportunity than anywhere else in the world. Is it perfect? No. I probably think that there are things which could change. So I'm not going to give you an absolute answer. I'm not going to say, yes, it's been achieved. I certainly think it's been achieved to a much larger degree than most people are willing to admit, or that most people believe. Is an absolute no, but I think it's much more present, and I certainly don't think it's one of the main issues on our society nowadays. Are there things to improve? Yes, there will always be. But I don't think it should be as big of a focus on policymakers as it is at the moment.
Yeah, but what people would say is due to bias, and even though equality of opportunity has been achieved, due to bias, which many people argue still exists towards minorities, towards women, uh, those minorities will not, or women will not be chosen to the positions of power in the same way as a white straight man will be chosen. So, for example, if there was a choice for the high standing position, it's much more likely that white man would be chosen than black woman. Therefore, uh, this works as an argument for quotas, for example, that if we don't implement quotas and if we don't say, well, there has to be a certain number of people present on certain roles, then they would never get those roles.
So, firstly, a little unpack there. Again, part of this ties back to what I've said, which is that some groups doing less well outcomes does not mean that there hasn't been equality of opportunity. Again, you're right that in some positions of power and influence, certain groups are underrepresented. Certain groups are also overrepresented.
For example,
So I mean, again, certain immigrant groups are actually underrepresented, such as people generally of African origin. Actually, I'm not sure about some in America they are, or people of Muslim origin, or originating from Muslim sightings. East Asians and Jewish people, it's the opposite. They're actually overrepresented. So again, are we discriminating in favor of them? Or is it some cultural issues that have been going on, or how different cultures treat education and value it? Also, I mean, I believe that on average, gay people are more intelligent and actually tend to be, I'm not sure if they're overrepresented in certain positions. I might be wrong there. But anyway, it's also worth noting for the man-women division then, that you're right, men are very much overrepresented in positions of high power. Men are also massively overrepresented in positions of complete failure. In prisons, in the number of drug addicts, in the number of criminals, in the number of suicide victims. And I know that there's an argument that women attempt suicide more, but then the question is how many of the attempted suicides are actual suicides, etc. So the point is, you find men on both ends of the spectrum. If the society just favored men as people say it does, then you would only find them overrepresented on the good end of the spectrum. And, you also have to look at, if there are issues of discrimination, why haven't they been getting better with programs to help against it? And again, women in STEM, there have been, for decades now, there have been movements, there have been things being done in universities to, short of putting quotas, there have been things that have been done for decades to encourage women to it. It doesn't work. And it works better in countries which had fewer women's rights.
Yeah.
If it was discrimination, then that would have worked. Now, does that mean discrimination never happens? No. In fact, we also have to distinguish institutional discrimination from personal discrimination. People, people will personally always have biases. They will always discriminate, whether or not they know it. That's a smaller effect than most people think it is, but it's there. You just have, but, that's something which we can never fully get rid of. It's also quotas backfire. Because when you do quotas, people of any minority for which you put quotas will suddenly be assumed to be getting positions because of those quotas, which will actually con their perception. The perception will be that they didn't get there fairly or freely, that they got there because they were put there.
which is a harm to the whole society.
Which is a harm to our society. And the other issue with quotas is, and first thing, people, I think, often focus too much on one end of the issue. What do I mean by this? Again, look at, for example, getting people from certain ethnic minorities more to university. People try and help them, they try and put quotas, they try and do. The issue often is too late to be solved at the university level. The issue is often less good schools to begin with, because they come from more poverty-ridden areas,
Yeah.
a less stable home environment, with high rates of fatherlessness and so on in certain communities. You need to solve the issue at the root. You need to, fund schools better. You need to give all sorts of social help programs at the root of the issue. Because by the time people apply for university, they will already have less education. And you can't shoehorn them into environments which require a lot of education if they haven't received it before. It's not actually good for them. And again, what people focus less on is, there's a lot of talk about how, black people, for example, less likely to get into universities. But what people talk a lot less on is that even when they get in, dropout rates are much higher.
Yeah.
So you can try and, put more in. That's not going to help the dropout rates. You need to solve the issue at its root, which is the educational environment from the beginning. You can't shoehorn people in at a later stage.
That's a very good argument. And would you say, let me think about it. Would you say there is still space for improving equality, or would you say the conditions in the society in general are so that the full equality basically cannot be achieved. There will be always one minority group that just does better in certain positions than the other group.
I mean, can full 100% everything of perfect quality ever be achieved? To be honest, I don't know. It's kind of deep philosophical question. I prefer looking at the here and now. What we can improve. Can we improve some things? Yes. I don't think it's any of this cognitive bias and nonsensical quotas. What we can improve more concretely is, first thing, better childcare, so that women don't have to choose as much between having the family and having a job, so they can do both much better. You actually look at the pay gap difference between men and women, it's very similar after they leave university, and that it shoots up at around the time that women have children. So that's one big issue that you need to fix. And
Also, the big issue of women when compared to men for an employer is women are likely to go on a leave. That's why it kind of, one would argue that it would make sense for an employer to employ men rather than women, because then they wouldn't have to take care of this.
well, better childcare will actually help with that issue, because it would allow women to return to work earlier if they wanted to. If it's easier and it's free to leave children in a nursery, then women can get back to work whenever they want, or sooner anyway. And that means that there's less of an issue with, employers afraid that if they hire women and they'll have children, that they'll be left with a reduced workforce, which they're still paying for. So that is a other ways to help people is, first thing, we need to break up kind of sectarian communities, which form in many countries, or kind of ghettos, essentially, where lots of minorities group up in one area. That's not good for social cohesion. It's not good for educational outcomes. It's not good for exposing kids to society. We need to break that. We need to find ways to break that. And we need to improve schools from a younger level, from childhood. That's the way you do it.
Yeah. So, yeah, what we have discussed is gender pay gap as well. Would you say gender pay gap exists as a concept, or it's a matter of 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 it's very specific to certain areas? And so, would you say there are ways that we can measure bias? Because some people nowadays talk about unconscious bias, which is very, very hard thing to measure.
The problem with unconscious bias is unfalsifiable. You can always say people have and can be evidence that they had it. And this is the issue.
And it's very hard to eliminate. Even the it exists.
Well, here's the thing, right? These people, do you remember what I said earlier, people caring more about seeming virtuous than being effective? This is it. As more and more rights are gained, and by concrete measures, there's less and less, discrimination. Then how do you continue to fight? How do you continue looking virtuous to people? Simple. We say that people are discriminating in a way it's completely unprovable, completely unfalsifiable.
Right.
So that people can never say that the sufficient progress has been made. And so you can always continue the fight. And that's the problem with unconscious bias. Where also with the gender pay gap, it exists, right? On average, women get less than men. The question is, how much of that is discrimination? Less than people think. First thing, like I say, actually, if you look at the pay gap on women when you leave university, it's far smaller for a while until the age at which they start having children. So you want to solve that? Better childcare. And the rest of it, you often have, first thing, jobs that women go into. Some are sometimes less high pay. And like I say, STEM jobs tend to be higher paying, and women are less likely to go to STEM. And like I say, in countries with more inequality, women are actually more likely to go to STEM. So that's not an issue of discrimination. When women need more money to improve their status because society discriminates against them, they are more likely to make that choice. And the other issue is also things like women are less likely to ask for raise. Women are more likely to take time off. Men are more likely to work overtime. Men are less likely to take sick days off, even when they are sick. So men just seem to prioritize that aspect more. And that can help explain the rest of the gap.
So what you're saying is there are many factors that not only bias, although the bias might be a part of it, but what we can actually nowadays see is, I think, on the example of American elections. Yes, there are people that would vote for Trump and any man candidate against a woman candidate, but we can actually see, which not many people think about nowadays, that there are women who would, under any condition, vote for the first woman president.
Yeah, the issue. So it kind of builds. Well, I didn't know that proportion, by the way. The issue in America wasn't that Kamala Harris Clinton were women. It's that they made their campaigns around the fact that they were women, right? In Britain, Margaret
Hillary Clinton did that a bit more.
Yeah, but Kamala Harris as well, being the first black, whatever, woman person. Yeah, in Britain, Margaret Thatcher never boasted about how she was a woman. Actually, she was more proud about being the first prime minister with a science degree, the first prime minister being a woman. Well, yeah. And you find that in a lot of the Western world, actually hard right, supposedly reactionary, supposedly, far right parties actually are led by women. So France, Marine Le Pen. In Germany, I forgot her name, but the AfD. AfD is led by women. Giorgia Meloni in Italy. Even in Britain, some of the harder right parts of the Conservative Party, Priti Patel, Suella Braverman, are women. No one cares. What they care about is when you tell people that they should vote for someone because they're women. That makes men feel left out. That makes, men who have actual issues, working class men who, that makes them feel, like they're being ignored. It's also just patronizing, even to female voters, saying that you should vote for someone because, I was saying earlier, elections being back who you look like. It's just patronizing saying you should vote for this person because they look like you, never mind the ideas. And you can see in America how minorities are leaving the Democrat Party exactly because of this attitude. They want to vote for people who represent their ideas. They want to be patriotic. They don't want to be told, you have to vote like this because you are black. You have to vote like this because you're Hispanic. That's patronizing, it's condescending, it's actually just racist.
This was the position that Obama has taken during this election, saying to people, well, you should vote to the person that's cool.
What he actually did is he went to black voters and he said that he thought a lot of the reason why they weren't voting for Kamala Harris was because she was a woman and they were sexist. Firstly, it's an idiotic campaign strategy, right? Don't insult your potential voters.
Your own voters.
Yeah, don't insult your voter base.
Who traditionally have been to them.
Yeah, but secondly, black people overwhelmingly voted Democrat in 2016 when Hillary Clinton was candidate. So no, it's always not an issue of sexism, right? It's actually, the issue is his own attitude. The attitude that, if only people weren't biased, they obviously vote for us. And the sad thing is actually, if you do a pulse, and I believe they do polls, you find that Kamala Harris's actual policy positions were much more popular than any policy positions of Donald Trump, including among Republican voters. But the problem is that Democrats didn't talk policy. They talked race. They talked, women's rights. They use rights for everything, even if the term doesn't apply. So, they talk trans rights, women's rights, this rights, that rights, black people, because women, and so on. And they completely ignore the like go add to men is essentially saying, men, you should vote for Kamala Harris because it's better for women. Well, great. What's best for men? Okay. They never actually try to convince, half the electorate why they'd be any good for them. And then a shopper that part of the electorate doesn't vote for you. Wow. Yes, but so they didn't want to talk policy. They talk about identity politics and they talk about values. At the end of the day, when the other side's values are patriotism and duty and hard work, you're going to lose that, right? People are more and more interested in this kind of sectarianism. If they had actually talked policy, they might have won. But you see something in the UK with Reform UK, the party. Their tax cuts and increased spending would have resulted in increased deficit of £150 billion. It's completely unsustainable. Their plan to, stop the boats is just to send them back to France. Which if it was that easy, we'd have already done a long time ago. France is a solid country. They're not just going to accept the boats back. But no one really attacked them on that. Everybody attacked them on, oh, they're so racist, they're so No one actually sat down and talked policy with them, right? If you talk, voters are less stupid than a lot of these progressives take them for, and they're a lot less biased or discriminating than a lot of these progressives take them for. If you explain why your policy is good, they will come back to you. If you patronize them, they won't.
Well, and most of the people I think are up to change of their opinion and up to if a candidate that does, which I think was this ridiculous thing when during the debate Trump has mentioned that Haitian immigrants are eating cats and dogs with it, and people still voted for him because it's right. For me, it was just weird how Kamala Harris hasn't talked her policies out, because I have seen her document of charts of graphs, which is like 60 plus pages of her policies, what she would have done. And she only mentioned it in interviews in a way that was so, such an all amount of
We look at Donald Trump's policies of tariffs, which would actually make it buying things much more unaffordable for many people who are Asian.
And that's what they call tariff. As a tariff.
Yeah, that tariffs are a tax, right? And it's a tax that will often be passed on to the consumer. So people the Democrats never really attacked him head on for that. Their policy, look at their ads. Their ads weren't about tariffs are bad for you. Their ads were about if you're not voting for her, you're sexist. Again, you don't insult your potential voter base. But yeah, people haven't been talking policy. Labor didn't talk policy, though. That's really because they don't really have any. They've mostly just been kind of flip-flopping, feeling their way around and destroying economic growth while they're at it. But so be it. But yeah, we never really confronted reform about its bad policy.
But the problem is it's so hard to attack Donald Trump or on anything. Because if you can see American politics nowadays, is I think if you see it, for it's pretty much Donald Trump attacking everyone and Democrat Party, and they're responding. They're never in the position to attack Donald Trump. They can only provoke him with
They're not in a position to attack Donald Trump in the way they're trying to attack him, which are personal attacks, which is saying he's bigoted, which is saying, his personality, which might be like actually some of it, honestly. But you know what they are in a position to do? Attack his dreadful policy. Do they know? The problem is that they choose to play on Trump's own playing field. Trump has created these personal attacks. That's loathsome, right? This is his playing field. The Democrats have chosen to continue on that playing field. They've chosen not to change it to something where they can win. And, also the Democrats haven't been above personal attacks. Again, calling your voters racist, calling Trump voters garbage.
Yeah.
It's this. The difference is that when Trump insults people, he doesn't insult his own voters.
Yeah, which is ridiculous. We could see, okay, it was clear that during 2016 debates, people could have not fully adjusted to the style that Donald Trump has. That's why people might have reacted. You could see a lot of people attacking Trump in return, and then getting his, best moments, which are all over YouTube. But now that everybody knows who is Donald Trump. Everybody knows that if you provoke him, if you do like Kamala, like you poke him, and he suddenly just starts saying weird stuff and protecting his ego, which was pretty easy in this election to use to also at the show.
It also doesn't help that Kamala Harris is extremely uncharismatic.
Right.
Anyway, thank you very much.
Good one.
Thanks, me.